A lonely widow in the Arizona Territory had just buried her husband and was barely surviving on pennies from mending clothes. Her children went to bed hungry more nights than not. Yet when a dust storm brought a confused elderly woman and a frightened boy to her doorstep, she didn't hesitate to bring them inside. She offered them her last bit of food, a place to sleep, and the warmth of her humble home. What she didn't know was that the old woman was Abigail Thornton, matriarch of the wealthiest cattle and mining family in the entire territory, and that one act of kindness would bring a man in a black coat riding into Red Creek the very next morning, changing everything Martha Dawson thought she knew about survival, charity, and second chances. I love knowing where my viewers are from. Drop your location in the comments below. Now, let's get into the story. Martha Dawson sat in the corner of her small adobe house, needle moving carefully through a torn shirt collar by the light of a single candle. Her fingers were calloused and sore, pricked a dozen times over from long nights of mending. The children were asleep on a straw mattress in the next room, huddled together under a thin quilt she'd patched so many times it was more thread than fabric. The wind outside howled through the cracks in the wooden shutters, carrying with it the dry, bitter dust of the high desert. Martha paused and rubbed her eyes. It had been 4 months since Thomas died in the mine collapse outside Copper Ridge. 4 months since she became a widow at 37. 4 months of stretching every coin until it screamed. Red Creek wasn't much of a town. A scattering of buildings along a dried-up riverbed, a general store, a saloon, and a chapel with a crooked steeple. Most folks who lived here were drifters, failed miners, or families too poor to move on. Martha had grown up here. She'd married here. And now she was trying not to starve here. Her husband had left her nothing but debts. The mining company paid out no compensation, said it was an act of God, not negligence. So Martha took in sewing and laundry, anything to keep food on the table. She mended shirts for ranch hands, patched dresses for the women at the saloon, and once even sewed a saddle blanket back together for a man who paid her in jerky and beans. It wasn't much, but it kept the roof over their heads. Barely. She'd sold nearly everything of value: Thomas's pocket watch, her mother's silver hairbrush, even the good dishes they'd received as a wedding gift. All that remained now were the essentials: a table, 2 chairs, a rusted stove, and her sewing kit. Prices had gone up since the railroad pushed through Copper Ridge. Flour that used to cost 30 cents now cost 60. A pound of sugar was a luxury she hadn't tasted in weeks. The ranch owners were getting rich off cattle drives, and the mine bosses were pulling silver out of the ground by the wagon load. But for people like Martha, life just got harder. She glanced at the pile of clothes waiting to be mended. 3 shirts, a pair of trousers with a torn knee, and a coat missing most of its buttons. If she finished them all by morning, she'd make enough to buy a little cornmeal and maybe some lard, maybe. Her son Samuel had asked her that morning if they could have meat for supper. She'd smiled and told him soon, but the truth sat heavy in her chest. There was no soon. There was only today, and today there was nothing. Still, Martha Dawson didn't complain. She didn't curse God or shake her fist at the sky. She'd learned long ago that survival wasn't about fairness. It was about keeping your head down, your hands busy, and your heart just soft enough to remember you were still human. Outside, the wind picked up, the kind of wind that came before a dust storm. Martha stood and checked the shutters, making sure they were latched tight. She blew out the candle to save the wick and sat in the dark, listening to the desert rage against her tiny home. She had no idea that before the night was over, 2 strangers would knock on her door, and that her life would never be the same again. The storm hit just after sundown. It came fast and mean, the way desert storms always did. One moment the sky was burnt orange, the next it was swallowed by a wall of brown dust that turned day into night. The wind screamed through the streets of Red Creek, rattling shutters and tearing loose anything that wasn't nailed down. Martha had just tucked Samuel and and rose into bed when she heard it, a faint sound beneath the howl of the wind. A voice, no, two voices, one high and frightened, the other low and confused. She moved to the window and peered through a crack in the shutters. At first, she saw nothing but swirling dust. Then, through the haze, two figures emerged. A small boy, no older than 7, stumbling forward with his arm wrapped around an elderly woman who could barely stand. The woman's dress was caked in dirt, her hair wild and loose. The boy's face was streaked with tears and dust. Martha didn't think. She just moved. She threw open the door, and the wind nearly ripped it from her hands. "Here," she shouted, waving them toward her. "Come inside, quickly." The boy looked up, his eyes wide with desperation. He half dragged, half carried the old woman toward the door. Martha grabbed the woman's other arm and pulled them both inside, slamming the door shut behind them. For a moment, no one spoke. They just stood there, breathing hard, shaking off the dust. The boy coughed violently, his small body trembling. The woman stared blankly at the wall, her mouth moving but no sound coming out. Martha knelt down in front of the boy. "You're safe now," she said gently. "What's your name?" "Ben," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Benjamin. And who's this with you?" Ben looked up at the old woman, his lip quivering. "My grandma. Her name's Abigail, but she doesn't know where we are. She got confused. We were walking, and then the storm came, and I didn't know what to do." Martha's chest tightened. She'd seen this before. Her own grandmother had suffered the same affliction in her final years, moments of clarity followed by long stretches of fog. It was a cruel thing, watching someone you loved disappear piece by piece. She stood and gently took Abigail's hand. The woman flinched at first, then looked at Martha with cloudy, uncertain eyes. "Ma'am," Martha said softly, "my name's Martha. You're in my home. You're safe here." Abigail blinked slowly. Her lips moved, forming words that didn't quite connect. I was looking for the ranch. Harrison said he'd be waiting." "It's all right," Martha soothed. "We'll figure it out. But first, let's get you warm." She led them both to the small table and sat them down. Ben was shivering so hard his teeth chattered. Martha grabbed the quilt from her own bed and wrapped it around his shoulders, then did the same for Abigail with the only other blanket she had. The pot on the stove still had a bit of bean soup left from earlier. It wasn't much, barely enough for one person, but Martha ladled it into 2 tin cups and set them in front of her guests. "Drink this," she said. "It'll warm you up." Ben took the cup with both hands and drank greedily. Abigail just stared at hers, her hands resting limply in her lap. Martha lifted the cup to the woman's lips and helped her take a sip. Samuel appeared in the doorway, rubbing his eyes. "Mama, who are they?" "Friends," Martha said simply. "They got caught in the storm. Go back to bed, sweetheart." Samuel looked at Ben with curious eyes, then nodded and shuffled back to the other room. Martha sat down across from the boy and the old woman, watching them carefully. She didn't know who they were or where they'd come from. All she knew was that they were lost, cold, and afraid. And in that moment, that was enough. Sometimes kindness doesn't ask questions, it just opens the door. The storm raged through the night, but inside Martha's small home, there was warmth. Ben had finally stopped shivering. He sat curled up on the floor near the stove, the quilt still wrapped around his shoulders, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. Abigail had dozed off in the chair, her head tilted to one side, her breathing slow and uneven. Martha sat across from them, mending by candlelight. She should have been sleeping, but sleep felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. Not with 2 strangers in her home, not with questions still unanswered. She glanced at the boy. He was staring into the dying embers of the stove, his face pale and drawn. "Ben," she said softly, setting down her needle, "can you tell me what happened? How did you and your grandma end up out there?" Ben didn't look at her right away. His fingers twisted the edge of the quilt. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. We were at the ranch. Grandma wanted to go for a walk. She does that sometimes. Says she needs to clear her head, but then she started walking the wrong way, toward the ridge. I tried to tell her, but she wouldn't listen. She kept saying she had to find someone named William. Martha's brow furrowed. William? Her husband, Ben said quietly. He died a long time ago, before I was born, but sometimes she forgets. She thinks he's still alive. She thinks she's young again. Martha felt a pang in her chest. She understood that kind of grief. The kind that didn't fade, that echoed through the years, warping time and memory. So you followed her, Martha said. Ben nodded. I didn't want her to get lost, but we walked too far. And then the storm came. I couldn't see anything. I just kept holding her hand and walking, and then I saw your light. Martha's throat tightened. This boy, no older than 7, had kept his grandmother alive through sheer will. He hadn't panicked. He hadn't given up. He just kept moving. You're a brave boy, Ben, she said. He shook his head. I was scared. Brave people are always scared, Martha replied. That's what makes them brave. Ben looked up at her then, his eyes glassy with unshed tears. Will she be okay? Martha glanced at Abigail, still asleep, her face lined and weary. I don't know, sweetheart, but she's safe tonight. That's what matters. Ben nodded, then wiped his nose on his sleeve. My pa's probably looking for us. He'll be real worried. Your pa? Harrison Thornton, Ben said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He owns the Thornton Cattle Company and the silver mines up in Copper Ridge. He's got men riding out looking for us, I bet. Martha froze. Her needle slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the table. Thornton. Everyone in the territory knew that name. Harrison Thornton was one of the richest men west of the Mississippi. He owned half the land between Red Creek and Copper Ridge, controlled the largest cattle operation in Arizona, and his mines produced more silver than any other in the region. His name was spoken with respect, fear, and sometimes envy. And this boy, this small, trembling boy sitting in her home, was his son. Martha's mind raced. She looked at Abigail, slumped in the chair, and suddenly the fine stitching on her dress made sense. The quality of the boy's boots, scuffed and dusty though they were. Even the way he spoke, polite, measured, like he'd been raised with tutors and manners. Ben, Martha said carefully, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. Does your father know where you are? Ben shook his head. I don't think so. We left before anyone noticed. Martha stood and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. The storm was still raging, but somewhere out there, men were searching. Powerful men, men with resources and influence, and by morning, they would find this place. She turned back to the boy and the sleeping woman, her chest tight with a feeling she couldn't quite name. She had no idea that her life was about to change forever. Morning came slow and quiet. The storm had passed, leaving behind a blanket of fine dust that covered everything like ash. The sun rose pale and reluctant over the desert, casting long shadows across Red Creek. Martha woke with a start, her neck stiff from sleeping upright in the chair. She'd kept watch through most of the night, dozing only in brief, restless intervals. Across the room, Ben was still curled on the floor, fast asleep. Abigail sat where Martha had left her, awake now, but staring vacantly at the wall. Martha stood and stretched, her bones aching. She moved to the stove and stirred the coals, adding a few precious sticks of kindling. There wasn't much left, just enough for one more pot of coffee, maybe some cornmeal mush if she stretched it thin. She filled the kettle with water from the bucket and set it on the stove. As it began to heat, she heard Abigail murmur something. "Ma'am," Martha said gently, moving closer. Abigail turned her head slowly. Her eyes were clearer this morning, but still distant. Where am I?" "You're in Red Creek," Martha said. "You and your grandson got caught in the storm last night. I brought you in." Abigail's brow furrowed. "My grandson?" Martha gestured toward Ben, still asleep. "Benjamin, he's been taking care of you." Abigail stared at the boy for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then softly she whispered, "He looks like William." Martha didn't respond. She just placed a hand on Abigail's shoulder and squeezed gently. Outside, the sound of hoofbeats echoed through the quiet morning. Heavy, deliberate, moving fast. Martha's heart jumped. She moved to the window and looked out. 3 riders were coming down the road, 1 in front, 2 behind. The man in the lead wore a black coat and a wide-brimmed hat, his jaw set and his posture rigid. Even from a distance, Martha could feel the weight of his presence. Behind him, 2 ranch hands rode with rifles slung across their saddles. Their eyes scanned every building, every alley, every shadow. Martha's stomach twisted. She stepped back from the window and looked at Ben, still asleep, oblivious to what was coming. The hoofbeats stopped outside her door. A moment later, there was a sharp knock. 3 heavy strikes that echoed through the small house. Ben's eyes flew open. He sat up, disoriented, his hair sticking up in all directions. "Pa," he whispered. Martha took a breath, smoothed her apron, and opened the door. The man standing on her threshold was tall, broad-shouldered, and clean-shaven. His dark eyes were sharp and unforgiving, the kind of eyes that had built an empire and crushed anyone who stood in the way. His coat was tailored, his boots polished despite the dust. Everything about him radiated power. Harrison Thornton. He didn't speak right away. He just looked at her, taking in her worn dress, her calloused hands, the threadbare home behind her. His expression didn't change, but Martha felt the weight of his judgment. "I'm looking for my son," he said, his voice low and controlled. "And my mother." Martha stepped aside without a word and gestured inside. Harrison moved past her, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. The 2 ranch hands stayed outside, hands resting on their rifle stocks, eyes cold and watchful. Ben scrambled to his feet. "Pa!" Harrison's face softened, just slightly. He crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to one knee, pulling the boy into his arms. "Are you hurt?" "No, sir," Ben said quickly. "I'm okay. Grandma got confused, and we got lost. And then the storm came, but this lady, she helped us. She gave us food and kept us warm." Harrison glanced up at Martha, his expression unreadable. Then he stood and turned his attention to Abigail, still sitting in the chair, staring at nothing. "Mother," he said quietly, kneeling beside her. Abigail blinked. She looked at him, her face blank. "Do I know you?" Harrison's jaw tightened. He closed his eyes for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, Mother, you know me." Martha stood in the doorway, her hands folded in front of her, watching the reunion unfold. She felt like an intruder in her own home. Harrison rose and turned to face her. His eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time, something flickered in his expression. Respect, or maybe something closer to debt. Harrison Thornton stood in the center of Martha's small home, his presence filling the space like a shadow. He looked around slowly, at the cracked walls, the patched furniture, the single candle burned down to a nub. His gaze lingered on the pile of mending in the corner, then returned to Martha. "You took them in," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir," Martha replied, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "In the middle of a dust storm. 2 strangers. They needed help." Harrison studied her for a long moment. His expression was hard to read, stern but not unkind. Finally, he reached into his coat and pulled out a leather wallet. He opened it and removed several bills, more money than Martha had seen in months. He held them out to her. "For your trouble." Martha looked at the money, then at him. She didn't move. "Take it," Harrison said. "I didn't do it for money," Martha said quietly. Harrison's brow furrowed. "Everyone does things for money. Not everyone." The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable, Behind Harrison, Ben watched with wide eyes. Abigail hummed softly to herself, oblivious. Harrison's jaw tightened. He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Mrs. Dawson, Martha Dawson. Mrs. Dawson, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but—" "I'm not playing any game," Martha interrupted, her tone firm now. "Your boy and your mother were lost and frightened. I gave them shelter because it was the right thing to do, that's all." Harrison stared at her, his eyes narrowing. He wasn't used to being refused. He wasn't used to people who didn't want something from him. Finally, he folded the bills and tucked them back into his wallet. "Then what do you want?" "Nothing," Martha said simply. "Nothing. Nothing." Harrison shook his head slowly, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You live in a house that's falling apart. Your children sleep on a straw mattress. You're mending clothes by candlelight just to survive, and you want nothing?" Martha's gaze didn't waver. "I want to keep my dignity, Mr. Thornton, and I want to teach my children that kindness doesn't come with a price tag." For the first time since he'd walked through the door, Harrison Thornton looked genuinely surprised. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. He glanced at Ben, then back at Martha. "You're a rare kind of fool, Mrs. Dawson," he said quietly. "Maybe," Martha replied, "but I can sleep at night." Harrison let out a slow breath. He turned to Ben. "Say thank you." Ben stepped forward, his small face serious. "Thank you, Mrs. Dawson, for everything." Martha knelt down and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You take care of your grandma, you hear? She's lucky to have you." Ben nodded, his eyes glistening. Harrison moved to Abigail and gently helped her to her feet. She went with him willingly, though her expression remained distant. As he guided her toward the door, she paused and looked back at Martha. "You have kind eyes," Abigail said softly. "Like my sister." She had kind eyes, too. Martha smiled. "Thank you, ma'am." Harrison led his mother outside, where one of the ranch hands helped her onto a horse. Ben followed, glancing back one last time before climbing up behind his father. Harrison mounted his own horse, then turned to face Martha, who stood in the doorway, arms crossed against the morning chill. "Mrs. Dawson," he said, his voice carrying across the dusty street, "I don't forget debts." "It's not a debt," Martha called back. Harrison's expression didn't change. "To me it is." He tipped his hat, turned his horse, and rode off with his family and his men, dust rising in their wake. Martha stood there long after they'd disappeared, watching the empty road. Samuel appeared at her side, slipping his small hand into hers. "Mama, was that really Harrison Thornton?" "Yes, sweetheart." "Are we going to be okay?" Martha looked down at her son and squeezed his hand. "We're always okay, Sam, long as we have each other." But even as she said it, something stirred in her chest, a feeling she couldn't quite name. Hope, maybe, or fear, or both. 3 days passed. Martha tried to put the encounter out of her mind. She went back to her routine, mending clothes, washing linens, stretching every scrap of food as far as it would go. Life in Red Creek didn't stop for anyone, not even after you sheltered the family of the richest man in the territory. But on the 4th morning, everything changed. Martha was hanging laundry on a line behind the house when she heard the sound of wagon wheels crunching over dirt. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked around to the front, squinting against the bright sun. A large freight wagon sat in front of her home, pulled by 2 sturdy horses. A man in a clean shirt and suspenders stood beside it, holding a clipboard. Behind him, 2 workers were already unloading crates and sacks. Martha's heart skipped. "Excuse me," she called out, stepping forward. "I think you've got the wrong house." The man looked down at his clipboard, then back at her. "You, Mrs. Martha Dawson?" "Yes, but—" "Then this is the right place." He gestured to the workers. "Delivery from the Thornton Ranch." Martha's mouth went dry. "I didn't order anything." "No, ma'am." "But Mr. Thornton did." The man handed her an envelope. "He said to give you this." Martha took it with trembling fingers. The envelope was thick, made of fine paper, sealed with red wax. She broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was sharp and precise. Mrs. Dawson, you may not believe in debts, but I do. What you did for my family cannot be repaid with money alone, but I will not allow you to continue struggling when I have the means to help. Consider this a beginning, not an ending. Respectfully, Harrison Thornton Starr. Martha looked up just as the workers set down the last crate. There were sacks of flour, cornmeal, sugar, and coffee. Crates of preserved vegetables, dried beef, and canned milk. A bolt of sturdy fabric, a box of candles, even a small cast-iron stove, newer and better than the rusted one inside. This is too much, Martha whispered. The man with the clipboard tipped his hat. Mr. Thornton doesn't do anything halfway, ma'am. Good day. He climbed onto the wagon and rode off, leaving Martha standing in the street, surrounded by more supplies than she'd seen in a year. Samuel and Rose came running out of the house, their eyes wide with wonder. "Mama, what is all this?" Rose asked, tugging on her skirt. Martha didn't answer right away. She just stared at the goods piled in front of her home, her chest tight with a swirl of emotions she couldn't untangle. Gratitude, shame, relief, fear. She'd wanted nothing from Harrison Thornton, but he'd given her something anyway. By midday, word had spread through Red Creek. Neighbors came by, curious and whispering. Some looked at Martha with envy, others with suspicion, a few with quiet admiration. Mrs. Callahan, the grocer's wife, stopped by with her arms crossed. "Heard you got yourself a rich benefactor," she said, her tone sharp. "I didn't ask for it," Martha said. "Doesn't matter. Folks are going to talk. Let them talk." Mrs. Callahan sniffed. "Just don't go thinking you're better than the rest of us now." Martha met her gaze, her voice calm but firm. "I've never thought that, Mrs. Callahan, and I never will." The woman huffed and walked off. That evening, after the children were asleep, Martha sat at the table with the letter in her hands. She read it again, her fingers tracing the words. Consider this a beginning, not an ending. What did that mean? She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her Bible. Then she stood and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street. For the first time in months, her cupboard was full. Her children had gone to bed with full bellies. The weight on her shoulders felt just a little lighter. But deep down, Martha knew this wasn't over. Harrison Thornton didn't forget debts, and somehow she suspected he wasn't done yet. 2 weeks later, Harrison Thornton returned to Red Creek. This time, he came alone. Martha was outside when she saw him riding up the street, tall and imposing in his black coat. She set down the basket of mending she'd been carrying and wiped her hands nervously on her apron. Her first instinct was to go inside, to avoid whatever conversation was coming, but she stayed where she was. Harrison dismounted and tied his horse to the post outside her gate. He removed his hat and nodded respectfully. "Mrs. Dawson." "Mr. Thornton?" He glanced at the house, then back at her. "May I have a word?" Martha hesitated, then gestured toward the small bench on her porch. "We can talk out here." They sat, the silence stretching between them like the desert horizon. Harrison turned his hat in his hands, his jaw working as if he were choosing his words carefully. "I came to thank you properly," he said finally, "and to apologize." Martha blinked. "Apologize? For how I spoke to you that morning." "I was frustrated, worried. I let that cloud my judgment." He looked at her then, his eyes sincere. "You showed my family mercy when they needed it most, and I treated you like you had an angle." Martha folded her hands in her lap. "You're a powerful man, Mr. Thornton. I imagine most people do have an angle." "Maybe, but you didn't." He paused. "My mother hasn't had a clear day in months. But yesterday she remembered you. She asked about the woman with the kind eyes who gave her soup." Martha's throat tightened. "I'm glad she's all right." "She's not all right," Harrison said quietly, "but she's safe. And that's because of you." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to Martha. "I have a proposition." Martha unfolded the paper. It was a contract, written in clean, formal script. Her eyes scanned the words, but they didn't quite make sense at first. "You're offering me a shop?" "A storefront," Harrison corrected, "in Copper Ridge, rent-free for the first year. After that, a fair rate, well below market value." He leaned forward slightly. "You're a seamstress. A good one, from what I hear. But you're wasting your skills mending torn shirts for pennies. I'm offering you a chance to build something real." Martha stared at the contract, her mind racing. "Why would you do this?" "Because I can. And because you deserve it. I don't want charity, Mr. Thornton." "It's not charity," Harrison said firmly. "It's an investment. You'll run the shop. You'll keep the profits. I'm just giving you the space to do it." He paused. "And if it makes you feel better, you can pay me back someday. When you're on your feet." Martha looked up at him, searching his face for any hint of deception. But all she saw was a man who meant what he said. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say yes," Harrison replied. "Say yes, and give your children a future." Martha's hands trembled as she held the contract. A shop, a real shop. Not just survival, but opportunity. Not just scraping by, but building something. She thought of Samuel and Rose, sleeping on that straw mattress. She thought of the long nights bent over mending by candlelight. She thought of Thomas, and what he would have wanted for them. "There's one more thing," Harrison said. "I'd like to hire you to make clothes for my ranch hands. Shirts, trousers, work coats, steady income while you build your business." Martha's breath caught. That's more than generous." "It's practical," Harrison said. "My men need clothes, you need work. Seems like a fair trade to me." He stood and placed his hat back on his head. "Think about it, Mrs. Dawson. You don't have to answer today." But Martha was already nodding, tears stinging her eyes. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, I'll do it." Harrison smiled, just slightly, but it was there. "Good. I'll have the storefront ready by the end of the month." He mounted his horse and tipped his hat. "Welcome to Copper Ridge, Mrs. Dawson." And then he rode away, leaving Martha standing there with a contract in her hands and hope blooming in her chest for the first time in years. 6 months later, the town of Copper Ridge had changed. Or maybe it was just that Martha could finally see it clearly. The storefront Harrison had given her sat on the corner of Main Street, with large windows that caught the morning sun and a hand-painted sign above the door that read, "Dawson and Company Fine Tailoring and Goods." Inside, the shelves were lined with neatly folded shirts, dresses hanging on hooks, work coats displayed by the window. The air smelled of fresh fabric and leather. A small stove kept the room warm, and in the back, 3 women sat at sewing tables, their needles moving in steady rhythm. Martha stood behind the counter, wrapping a package for a customer, a rancher's wife who'd just purchased 2 dresses and a wool shawl. The woman smiled warmly as she paid. "You do beautiful work, Mrs. Dawson. I'll be back next month." "Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate your business." As the woman left, the bell above the door chimed softly. Martha glanced up and saw Harrison Thornton stepping inside, Ben at his side. "Mr. Thornton," Martha said, surprised. "I wasn't expecting you." "Just passing through," Harrison said, looking around the shop with an approving nod. "Wanted to see how things were going. Better than I ever imagined," Martha admitted. She gestured to the women in the back. "I've hired 3 seamstresses from Red Creek. Women like me, widows, struggling to make ends meet. We're keeping up with orders. And we just got a contract to make uniforms for the Stagecoach Company." Harrison's expression softened. "You've built something here, Mrs. Dawson. Something that matters." Ben tugged on his father's sleeve. "Pa, can I go say hi to Sam and Rose?" Martha smiled. "They're in the back room doing their schoolwork." "Go ahead, sweetheart." Ben darted off, and Harrison stepped closer to the counter. He pulled an envelope from his coat and set it down. "What's this?" Martha asked. "Your first payment, for the ranch hand orders." He paused. "And a little extra. Call it a bonus." Martha opened the envelope and froze. It was far more than they'd agreed on. "Mr. Thornton, this is—" "Fair," Harrison interrupted. "You've done excellent work. My men are happier, better outfitted, and you've met every deadline. You've earned it." Martha's eyes glistened. "I don't know how to thank you." "You already have." Harrison glanced toward the back room, where the sound of children's laughter drifted through. "You gave my son his grandmother back, even if just for one night. You reminded me that not everyone in this world is looking to take. Some people just give." He placed his hat back on his head. "Keep doing what you're doing, Mrs. Dawson. This town needs more people like you." As Harrison turned to leave, Martha called out, "Mr. Thornton?" He paused and looked back. "Why did you really do all this?" she asked. "It's more than just repaying a debt." Harrison was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My wife died 3 years ago. Left me with Ben and my mother, both of whom needed more than I knew how to give. I built an empire, Mrs. Dawson, but I forgot how to be kind." He met her gaze. "You reminded me, and for that I'm grateful." He tipped his hat and walked out, the bell chiming softly behind him. Martha stood there, her heart full. She looked around the shop, at the women working, at the children playing in the back, at the shelves stocked with goods she'd made with her own hands. She thought of that stormy night, of the frightened boy and the confused old woman standing on her doorstep. She thought of the choice she'd made without hesitation, and she realized something. Kindness wasn't just an act. It was a ripple. One small choice, one open door, and lives could change, not just hers, but others too. She walked to the window and looked out at the bustling street of Copper Ridge. Somewhere out there, other women were struggling, just like she had. Other families were barely holding on. But now, she had the means to help, and she would. Because sometimes, when the world offers nothing but storms, all a person can do is open the door. And Martha Dawson's door would always be open. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.